Hi, my name's Ian Wright, and I'm going to talk as an osteopath here about scoliosis and the way that we develop our midlines. And this is a wide subject, and I'm going to just briefly talk about very severe scoliosis, which needs surgery, for example, to very mild imbalances, structural imbalances between the left and right. So a scoliosis means actually that we have lost our sense of midline. There's a lateral curve in the spine, and these can be from a variety of issues, and they can be caused by a variety of problems, and they can cause us a variety of problems. So classically, how you would define scoliosis is this idea of idiopathic, meaning unknown cause. Who knows what this has come from? That's about 65% of those of scoliosis are unknown in their causes. About 15% are what could be classified as congenital, which is to do with developmental malformations of the spine. So literally the bones, like there's a hemivertebra, which means you're only born with half a vertebra. So you develop this kind of curve, the spine curves in compensation to this. The rest tend to be what's classified as neuromuscular, for example, and this is an area where we work with very much so, which is to do with cerebral palsy. And because of the damage to the long nerve tracts in cerebral palsy, there can be a differential growth between left and right in terms of the actual muscles which surround the spine. And because some of them are in spasm and are very rigid, it prevents growth, so that you can get this differential growth, so you get this lateral curvature, especially when these children start going through big growth spurts, say 7-8 years old, or especially when they're about 13. That's major. So scoliosis can be incredibly mild and cause very minimal problems for us, or it can be extremely severe and can even actually compromise the internal organs and can lead to a need for surgery. And personally, in practice, I see all of these. I see it from the mildest to the most severe. So actually, they are measured by this thing called the Cobb angle, which is the angle, the angle of lateral deviation, the way the spine deviates particularly, and they measure it by taking a compound X-ray to work out this angle. And an angle of, say, for example, less than 15 degrees would be considered mild, and there will be minimal treatment. An angle of, say, 15 to about 30 degrees would be considered moderate and may not be treated. Over about 30 degrees is classified as severe. And when you get to about 40 degrees, they tend to put you in a cast or brace it. And over about 45 degrees, they tend to looking at surgery because it can have further complications. Now, actually, in Ireland at the moment, it tends to be nearer 60 or 70 degrees when they're doing surgery on them, because there's actually such a waiting list, and there's very few surgeons that have that kind of training to do that very complex surgery and putting rods in, etc., etc. Now, I'm interested in looking at people with severe scoliosis, but I'm also interested in these very mild, what I would call lateral imbalances, left and right imbalances in the body, and they're incredibly common. And actually, you look at a lot of people and they have slight left-right imbalances in their spine. Now, they're actually classified as in the following way. First one, infantile scoliosis. This is pre-3 years old. There tends to be a family or a genetic cause. 90% of these children have what's called plagiocephaly, which means there is a left-right shape imbalance in the head. the head has this kind of quadrilateral shape where it's slightly anterior at the front. It's kind of more sticking out one side than the other, and it's flatter the opposite side, so everything's in this kind of parallelogram. Now that is usually caused by intrauterine position, as in the position the baby's lying pre-birth, and the mechanics here of the head and neck are slightly off a line, and the head shape is offline. The interesting thing, and this really confuses medics, is a child can be born with plagiocephaly, but they will not have any scoliosis at birth. Well, of course they won't, because what happens is when you've got plagiocephaly, the head and neck is slightly misaligned. So actually we're interested in terms of our development or our posture. We have to keep our eye straight, our brain straight. So if you've got this left-right discrepancy and our head and neck are slightly misaligned because of that kind of birth strain in our head, what we do is we compensate with the rest of our spine. So as our posture develops, as we go from lying down to 5 to 6 months when we are sitting up and we're holding our neck up, then you start to see these imbalances develop, and especially when we start to form gait, when we start walking, then these things tend to show up, which is pre-3 years old. So the interesting thing about them is if you've got a Cobb angle of, say, more than 50 degrees with this infantile scoliosis, it tends to be a problem. If it's less, they can resolve themselves, they can compensate themselves. There is another form which is far worse called progressive infantile, which actually genetically happens about 80% in boys, and that's a different subject, and it's rarer actually. I have seen it. Then you've got a more childhood scoliosis, which tends to happen between 5 and 11 years old at growth spurts. So you tend to have a differential, meaning different areas grow at different times, and you can get this lateral kind of curve of the spine developing. It can be linked to an old plagiocephaly pattern, which is unresolved and as it hasn't even been spotted. What we're always interested in when we're evaluating these is what is the head and what are the mechanics of the head and neck doing, and what's the mechanics of the cranial base, what we call the cranial base, which is actually the kind of bones in the skull which the brain sits on. They're very important because they can have these kind of what we would call a lateral shear, a strain pattern, which can cause this left-right imbalance. And if that left-right imbalance remains in the head, and sometimes there is no outward plagiocephaly, meaning you can't see this odd shape, but it's internal, it can still cause lateral curve dysfunction, as in scoliosis, as the child develops and goes towards a childhood scoliosis. Now, one of the biggest ones that I would see in practice is adolescent scoliosis. This is from between 10 and 16 years old. So this tends to happen, interestingly enough, more in girls. No one knows why. What does happen though is it comes on very incredibly fast. 1 minute, no, literally, you can have a girl who is straight, and then a month later she's developed quite a severe scoliosis. Suddenly is noticed, and it's often noticed, like the girl I was seeing the other day, it's noticed by her friends at school when she's changing for gym, say, and suddenly it's it's suddenly very prevalent. Now these vary a lot. Some of them can be incredibly fast, change incredibly fast, and can be incredibly severe and need surgery. Often they can be very difficult to manage. What I tend to find is if you can get onto them incredibly quickly early, you can have a big and strong effect, but actually once they really set in, it's incredibly hard to treat them, and they often tend to go on and need surgery. They're very, very severe, and it's incredible how this imbalance shows up so much and is triggered by this rapid growth at adolescence. But what I'm really interested in is these kind of what I would call mild functional scoliosis, where you have something, you get when you have a patient who comes into practice, You get them to stand up, they take their shirt off, whatever, and you get the guy to bend over and you look at the back function, and there's often a left-right imbalance and what I would call a mild functional scoliosis. So the bones aren't any different, but the body it can be a C curve. The back can look like a C when you're looking at it, or it can be an S curve, which is slightly more compensated because, again, we're trying to keep the head and neck and eyes in alignment, and the pelvis can be twisted as well. So and also the jaw can be misaligned. So all these three kind of key areas, the head on the neck, the cranial bones, the jaw, and the pelvis, these four areas have to be in alignment. If they're not, the spine almost acts like a rope. It compensates, it twists. One end is out, the other end pulls out. It's almost like a snake. So you have to get these functional bases to sit correctly. So you've got to get the pelvis untwisted. You've got to get the cranial base aligned and the head on neck aligned and the jaw aligned. And often, just in doing those things, you can straighten the person up quite quickly, And that's not obviously in some of these more severe dysfunctional cases that we're talking about, where actually even when all of these, when you're treating a very severe progressive adolescent scoliosis, what we're interested in doing actually, because they may be heading towards surgery or they may be post-surgical, what I'm interested in those cases in doing is maintaining function, because the primary issue with scoliosis is pain, of course, back pain or rib pain. And they can be incredibly painful, especially adolescent scoliosis. And what we do even in these severe cases is release the ribs, allow the spinal joints to be as free and as to function as well as they can. And in doing so, it can minimize their feelings of pain. It can allow them to function within that scoliosis as much as they can. Now, on the other end of the scale, when you've got these mild imbalances where the pelvis is misaligned, or there's a problem with the feet being misaligned, or there's actually a problem with the head and neck or the cranial bones, you can align them, and suddenly they can come in and you do one or two things and they can walk out much straighter, and that's wonderful. It's actually important in other particular areas. For example, in some specific learning issues like dyslexias, sometimes dyspraxia, but more dyslexias, there can be this left-right imbalance in the cranial bones, and often it can manifest as these mild scoliosis. So actually, with all the kids that we're treating with learning difficulties, we always want to look at their spinal alignment, which tends to improve. It tends to be the first thing to improve actually when we're treating them, and is a one manifestation. They have a difficulty in holding their midline, and that's because there's this left-right imbalance. Important but subtle stuff. It's a huge subject to lecture on. I'm just giving you a little introduction. I hope you find that of value. I wish you well. Thank you.